Good morning. That coffee was really good, wasn't it? Our scripture reading this morning is Psalm 19. This can be found on page 498 in your Old Testament portion of your Pew Bible. Reading from Psalm 19. Hear what the Spirit says to the church. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In the heavens he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom from his wedding canopy, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising is from the ends of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them, and nothing is hid from its heat. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is clear, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and drippings of the honeycomb. Moreover, by them is your servant warned. In keeping them there is great reward. But who can detect their errors? Clear me from hidden faults. Keep back your servant also from the insolent. Do not let them have dominion over me. Then I shall be blameless and innocent of great transgression. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. This is the word of the Lord.
This summer we're spending Summer in the Psalms. It's a book that for a long time Presbyterians were intimately familiar with. It was the only thing that we were allowed to sing in church were the Psalms. The Psalms were, for 1,000 years before that, or thousands of years before that rather, the Psalms were the hymn book, the centerpiece of theology, the litany and the liturgy of the church. But in recent years, the Psalms have been less focused on. In almost a decade of ministry, I had never preached on a psalm before last week. The Psalms challenge us, they present opportunities for us to grow, but they convey the biblical truths and the reality of God's word in ways other than how we would expect or understand them normally. Our normal approach is tell me a story or give me some instruction for how I'm going to live my life, and I will go and do it. The Psalms don't approach life like that. The Psalms we saw last week were much more interested in helping us grasp the basic reality of God and then asking us, so what are you going to do about it? The Psalms ask the intrinsic question, how then shall we live? From 1971 to 2011, the incidence of Canadians identifying as none when it came to religious identity rose from 4% to 24% of the population. Among those born after 1980, that number jumps to 30%. Fully 2 generations of Canadians, with a third coming up, have been raised on a story that says unless you can hold it in your hand, unless you can measure it and qualify it and quantify it, it's not really real. And I ask you the rhetorical question, are they any happier for it? Is there a better story? Edna St. Vincent Millay, the 1923 Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, agreed. Day after day, she watched the universe unfold as physics dictated it must. spinning in its respective orbit. The monotony of it all left her wholly uninspired, which is a strange thing for a poet to feel. Day turned into night, night turned into day. And she asked herself if this Newtonian universe was all that she inherited, where mastery of all things natural lay within the realm of human potential. Was this all there was? Upon this gifted age, she wrote, in its dark hour rains from the sky a meteoric shower of facts, lying unquestioned, uncombined. Wisdom enough to leach us of our ill is daily spun, but there exists no loom to weave it into fabric. It's poet speak for we need a better story. We deserve a better story. For most of human history, a better story has been assumed. We're trained to look at the sunrise and see the brilliance of God's artistry. Consider, Jesus said, the flowers of the field. Aren't they more brilliantly arrayed than a bride on her wedding day? It's philosophic basic causality. Our brains are programmed to see cause and effect in the world around us. Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest thinkers in the history of Christianity, claimed that this was indeed proof for God's existence. That since everything that exists has a cause, an uncaused cause is a logical necessity. And we call that cause God. This is the story that the church has been told to assume. It's the same story that the psalmist assumes. But today we're told a different story. We're told that our brain has been programmed to see cause and effect not because of a universal cosmological sense, but merely a survival instinct. Seeing cause and effect helped us stay alive better. That the artistry in a sunset is not a sign of God's beauty in the world, but an arbitrary ascription to randomness and particle physics. When everything that you perceive is all that you receive, it's natural to feel deceived. The author of Psalm 19 thinks that we need a better story, because not all grace is created equal. There is a grace that's common. Here's how the psalmist puts it from Gareth's reading. The heavens declare the glory of God. The sky proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. I remember the feeling I got of my breath leaving my lungs when I reached the summit for the first time at Grossmore Mountain on Labor Day weekend of 2002. One of the highest points in eastern Canada, I bore witness to what I can only imagine was every single color that can possibly exist laid out in a grand, supersized mosaic. The impossible extravagance of that view has been burned into my memory, but the strange thing is I can't tell you a single person that I made that trip with. God gave every single one of us the same view and asked absolutely nothing of any one of us in return. God makes the rain fall on the just and the unjust alike, Jesus reminds us. Creation doesn't play favorites. Every single one of us, every single person who draws breath, whose heart beats, gets access to the same set of inputs. And you can call it free will, or you can call it circumstance, or you can call it predestination. But when it comes to the human program, identical inputs don't result in identical outputs. Because not all grace is created equal. There's another kind of grace that the psalmist points us to. A better grace. More desired than gold and sweeter than honey, he says. This is grace that makes a difference. It's grace that points beyond itself to something bigger. Like a signpost screaming for recognition that everything common has a best before date on it. The most beautiful leaves you can see from the highest mountain you can imagine will still crumble into dust before too long. Given enough time, even that tallest mountain will be wiped away by a river's steady flow. Special grace has a duty first to remind us that the most common truth in the universe is that nothing lasts. And if special grace's first job is to fill us with a kind of dread or existential despair, then I suppose good. Because C.S. Lewis puts it this way: creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger because there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim because there is such a thing as water. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Special grace, the psalmist says, invokes eternity in our hearts, and in doing so sparks our thirst for it. More than that, though, beyond even that, special grace has a responsibility and the ability by its nature to point beyond itself and again declare that if everything is created with a cosmic best before date, all that is good and true and right or just must find root in the same sense of the eternal. Special grace beckons from eternity with life on one hand and truth on the other. Embrace what is on offer, the psalmist urges. Don't settle for hamburger when steak is on the menu. Not all grace is created equal. We need a better story. We deserve a better story. The church has a better story. The author of Hebrews puts it this way: as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is better than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. We have a better story. The church knows what the psalmist could only have dreamed of, that eternity's truth and eternity's life would commingle and reveal the way to know the one whose glory is testified to by the heavens and whose handiwork the mountains proclaim. Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified, risen, ascended, and reigning Christ, is the icon of grace in the midst of the mundane. Jesus himself is creation's better story. He is the perfect law of the Lord and God's sure decree. He is the right precept and the clear commandment. He is the Word made flesh to dwell among us, and he is let there be and there was. He is who the psalmist points to but could not name. Jesus is the law of the Lord that revives the soul and reveals its purpose. During the British occupation of Palestine in the 1920s, a combined force of British, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers were pressing on the rear of the Turkish retreat over arid desert near Beersheba. The attack outdistanced its water-carrying camel trains, and with water bottles empty and the sun blazing pitilessly out of the sky, vultures wheeled overhead expectantly. One British officer's journal recounts it this way: our heads ached, our eyes became bloodshot and dim in the blinding glare. Our tongues began to swell, our lips turned purplish black and burst. Those who dropped out of the column were never seen again, but the desperate force battled on to Syria. Syria? Battled on. There were wells there, and we had been unable to take the place. Had we been unable to take the place by nightfall, thousands were doomed to die of thirst. We fought that day as men fight for their lives. We entered Sharia station on the heels of the retreating Turks. The first object which met our view were great stone cisterns full of cold, clear drinking water. In the still night air, the sound of water running into the tanks could be distinctly heard, maddening in its nearness. Yet not a man murmured when orders were given for the battalions to fall in, too deep, facing the cisterns. He goes on to describe the stern priorities. The wounded, those on guard duty, then company by company, over 4 hours before the last man had had a single drink of water. And in all that time, they had been standing 20 feet from a low stone wall on the other side of which were thousands of gallons of water. We were made for more than this world has to offer. More than the fame, more than the wealth, more than the power, more than the privilege, more than the beauty, more than the success. We were made for more than all of it. God's intention for us from the moment of our creation was that we would walk with him in the cool of the garden, as Genesis describes it. And yet every day we find ourselves parched, empty, and dry. Augustine puts it this way: "You have made us for yourself, O God, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." We've all felt it, haven't we? I mean, we live in a world where if you walk into any Starbucks in Calgary today, the door invites you to be part of something bigger at a coffee shop. From body butter to shoe companies, the marketplace is filled with corporations who have figured out what the psalmist has already told us, that we are thirsting for something deeper than ourselves. And truthfully, in all honesty, there are probably a million different ways that you can try and slake your thirst. The fact that we're thirsty doesn't necessarily prove Jesus is the way or the truth or the life. But what Jesus offers is unique proof that only he can satisfy. The singular claim of Christianity, the empty tomb, tells us that something you do will never quench your thirst. But what about something that you can be? An empty tomb is the offer for our soul to a chance to find resurrection life flooding into our veins, reviving our weary, parched, empty, dry soul. And from this very resurrection life, from this restoration soul, the Lord's decree, as the psalmist puts us, invites us to consider what it is to be made wise. If Christ is risen, the American theologian Yaroslav Pelikan stated, nothing else matters. But if Christ is not risen, nothing else matters. Jesus' resurrection reveals to the mind a proper perspective, that there is a unity in the human condition that the resurrection brings to light. All of us have an end date. All of us have an expiry date. All of us have a best before date because we are all created. And in our culture, this truth, this reality that none of us can escape is as close as we get to anathema. Our culture is so deeply invested in telling us that you are enough and you are all that you need that we push death so far to the margins that we can't imagine having to deal with it. To prove this point, in 2012, the company Catacombo produced a coffin with a Spotify connection, so that visitors to your grave can tap in and can plug in and play you all of the hits that you are missing. There's a wisdom to Pelikan's formula that follows the Apostle Paul's logic to the Corinthians. If there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not risen. And if Christ is not risen, nothing else we do matters. if there is no hope beyond the grave, if there is no life beyond this life, then what you do here will fade. No matter how good you are at what you do, no matter how important you think you can make yourself, someday all of it will be forgotten. Someday all of it will be wiped clean. Someday all of it will be nothing. But the audacity of Christian wisdom becomes a conscious adoption then that life or death is not something to be feared at all. That if the tomb is empty, and everything hinges on this central truth, if the tomb is empty, then there is nothing I can lose that I won't gain. There is nothing I can put down that won't be picked up again. There is nothing that can be feared that can't be overcome. That one is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. And so the audacity of Christian wisdom embraces the Beatitudes. Blessed are the persecuted. Blessed are the weak. Blessed are those who are powerless. Lucky are those who are unlucky. Because by embracing the wisdom of the resurrection perspective, we choose to offer our bodies, ourselves, our very being as a living sacrifice, which is our spiritual act of worship. Likewise, the final two pieces of the psalmist puzzle find their root in consideration of Jesus' own resurrection. Jesus reveals priorities that make the heart rejoice and principles that bring enlightenment. The American theologian Marva Dawn wrote, "Your life is shaped by the end you live for. You are made in the image of what you desire. Your priorities and your principles are married." 2 years after I was ordained, Beth and I were out at a family's home for a visit when one of their neighbors stopped by, and I was introduced to her. "Oh," she said to me, "you're the minister at the Presbyterian Church." "That's my church." Beth and I looked at each other on the drive home and thought, is it? 2 years, is it? Because we all know the reality that talk is easy. Talk is cheap. It is easy to say, this is important to me or that is important to me. A mentor of mine told me once that if you really want to know what a person values, you only need to look at two things. Take a look at their bank account and take a look at their calendar. Those two things will tell you everything that you need to know about a person's priorities and a person's principles. How we choose to spend our money and our time is our testimony to the world. What we do with what we have will either boost or tear down the story of God that the Church of Jesus Christ lived and died and rose for and has been entrusted with. Brennan Manning wrote about it this way: "The single greatest cause of atheism in the world today is Christians. Christians, those who acknowledge Jesus with their lips and then walk out the door and deny him with their very life. This is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable." The resurrection of Jesus presents the church with an essential choice. Christ is risen or he's not. And the psalmist invites us to consider the implications of that resurrection. Do we live, will we live, can we live as though the tomb is empty, or can't we? Because there is no middle ground on this truth. Because the world deserves a better story. Amen.